Our next speaker is Ione Fine. Many of you know her well, especially Smith-Kettlewell. And Ione is a major figure in the field of brain plasticity and blindness. So, Ione.
Thank you. Great. Can everyone hear me here? Okay, great. I gave a very vague title because I didn't know what I was going to talk about. And this talk is going to be a little bit of a work in progress, but I think it's a nice way to end the day, because one thing this symposium has done that's been really fascinating is it's brought together people who often aren't in the same room, but have interests in common. People interested in synaptic plasticity, people interested in behavior and function, and all kind of coming together to kind of look at the question in different ways. And that's one of the things that really sort of motivates what I do in the lab. So when you're congenitally blind, or many of the other conditions we've talked about today, we know that the brain is this amazingly adaptable organ. And so we know that the gross anatomy of the brain, including white matter tracts that connect visual areas, developed prior to this experience-dependent plasticity. This all happens in utero, as has already been explained. Then shortly after birth, or shortly before birth, during a period of early plasticity, regulated by a cascade of neurochemical and structural events, visual experience fine-tunes this local functional circuitry. And that's the point where experience starts really playing a role. And then this plasticity continues throughout most of the lifespan. It seems to shut off completely when you hit menopause, but I'm learning to live with it, driven by environmental interactions. And rich environment and physical exercise play a role. So that might be my problem. And finally, what we do know is that kind of lack of visual input early in life, or abnormal visual input early in life, delays the sensitive period. And if this continues for a long period of time, you get cross-modal plasticity, where deprived sensory cortex is either reorganized to respond to the remaining senses. And I would say, and this is a controversial thing, is even though I've been studying cross-modal plasticity for 15 years, I'm still uncertain that what we're not looking at is just an artifact, that it's simply kind of, meaningless signals in the back of the head that don't really help with function. But, I'm hoping to get the answer to that question before I retire. I'm going to talk about how do early blind individuals experience object motion. I'm going to highlight the work of 3 really talented students in my lab: Melissa Sines at INSERN, Fang Zhang from the University of Auditory, and Woonju Park, who's at UW and is going to move to Georgia Tech soon. And I'll shout out to Michael Baylor, who will highlight his own work later in this conference. Okay. And what we're going to talk about is this idea of how early blind individuals experience object motion. And I'm going to try to tie together a bunch of ways of looking at the problem, from behavior. Are they better at it? How do they make their way around a sighted world? To neural responses. What are the neural responses that are happening in the brain? How is this affected by the anatomy? How does this affect the anatomy? And finally, what are the underlying computations that allow that these changes are implementing? So you have these neural and anatomical synaptic changes that change the computations that are happening neurally, and that's affecting the behavior. And what I'm trying to do in my research is tie these together. So what we know is that if you have a sighted child, there will be primarily visual in the way they interact with the world. And that visual information is going to go to an area called HMT+, which is a complex of areas, including an area called MT, MST, and a bunch of other kind of motion sensitive areas. And they're going to be able to make their way around the world using vision. They will also have the ability to understand auditory motion, things that are moving, that you can hear them move, like a bird singing as it flies by. Birds actually don't sing as they fly, but never mind. And that happens in this area we think called planum temporale, which is an auditory area. It's much smaller. But if you're a blind child and you don't have access to visual motion, then you're tracking where the dog is or where the bird is by auditory motion. And what we do know is that your ability to understand those motion signals is really good. And what I have is a picture up here of, first of all, a blind woman crossing the road. And I saw her as I was driving into work one day. And what's interesting about this picture, for those of you who are blind, is that it's not just a simple road with a woman, sitting crossing the road. It's a Y junction. So there are cars going kind of in front of her and behind her. And that's important, of course, anyone who's blind knows this, because it's really difficult to hear things from the front, with what's in front of you and what's behind you. And so she can't just wait for the cars to stop, because even when the cars have stopped in front of her, the people behind can't see her cane and they're still driving. So she's really got to segregate out these two motion signals to cross the road. And I saw her doing this and I was like, that's really cool, right? And then I stopped, I chopped the car and I ran back. And by the time I got there, she was already out of there. And then I went and stood there with my eyes shut. And I was like, I would never have gotten across that road. I would still be standing there like a bag of bones. So, she was obviously doing something that I can't do, which is cool. And the other picture I have up there is a bunch of blind soccer players playing with a musical ball. And again, what you can see in the picture is that they're not just chasing the ball, right? I could do that. I don't, and I won't, but I could. But they're actually, you can see that one of them is deliberately blocking out another player. So he's hearing these footsteps. He's got there's this melee of people coming into the ball, and this person is using the hearing to know that he wants to block someone else so he can grab the ball. I believe it's the Brazilian team, because a Brazilian scientist gave me a rave lecture for my talk, because this is the Brazilian team. So I was interested in this sort of very complex motion perception. So we developed a task that we call the crazy freeway. And what it is we have all these cars, and these cars have different auditory frequencies. They go, which is kind of like a truck, to which is a little kind of EV, electric vehicle. And the cars can go in different directions. So in the picture I'm showing you here, 6 of the cars are going in one direction and 2 of the cars going the other way. So it's like being in the middle of a crazy freeway, and there's a rush hour that's meaning that most of the directions are going, most of the sounds are going one way and not another. But collectively, if you don't have the spatial information, which you guys do not, you won't be able to tell the direction. This will eventually stop. Thank you. So for sighted people, this task is really hard. They're working about 70%. Blind people find it super easy. They're like at 90% here. So they have no problem doing this task. Sighted people really hate this task and find it very frustrating. And so this is like a good example of sort of, okay, blind people go out in the world, they're making this use of auditory information. We found a task that kind of seems to tap into what they know how to do and we don't. So the question is do they do this with planum temporale, the auditory areas that sighted people use, or perhaps, is there a more interesting hypothesis, perhaps do they use this area MT, this visual motion area that is dedicated to vision and visual people? And so Melissa Sines did this beautiful study where she took sight recovery subjects. So these are people who are blind when they're born. They're blind for most of their life, or blind close to when they're born. They're blind for most of their life, then they get their sight back. So they're kind of like hybrids. They can see visual motion, but they also seem to have the kind of cross-modal responses you expect from people with cross-modal plasticity who've been blind all their life. And so this is a group of sighted controls that I'm showing here. And it's a very simple experiment. There's responses to auditory motion, there's responses to visual motion. And what you can see is there's a little bit in the back of the head, which is this area MT that's responding to visual motion. And there are some auditory motion areas, one of which is pretty close to the visual motion area, but they're not overlapping. That's the important thing. But if we look at a sight recovery subject, what you see is that that region that was responding to, there's a big region of that responds to auditory motion in that area where MT is, and some of it is also responding to visual motion. So it looks like this visual motion area MT has been taken over by auditory motion. And now this area in these sight recovery subjects responds to both vision and auditory motion. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is kind of start, okay, we found this area. This is really cool. Well, now we're going to start thinking about the computations. Well, the most obvious computation you make in motion is which direction is it going? Is it going left or is it going right? I know that's a very simple computation, but I'm a straightforward kind of girl. So Feng Zhong, what she did is she took that same task and she basically measured brain responses while these people did this task. So all they're doing is listening to these cars and they're deciding they're going to the left or they're going to the right. And what you do is you basically take either this region MT that responds to visual motion in sighted people, and we think responds to auditory motion in blind individuals, or you take this area planum temporale, and you take basically the chunk of the brain that corresponds to that brain area, and you look at the pattern of responses in that brain area. Because you're not going to have a bigger response to left and the right, or a bigger response to right and left, unless you're a very weird human being. But the pattern of responses in that brain area might differ between left and right. And so what you do is you take the training set, which is a bunch of examples of leftward motion, and you say, okay, that's what the average pattern looks like. And you take a bunch of rightward, and you say, well, that's what the average pattern looks like. And then you take a new piece of data, and you say, does it look more like left or does it look more like right? And you can use a really fancy deep learning algorithm, or you can use a simple linear classifier, and it doesn't make any difference. Sorry, Frank Tong, wherever you are. That's my experience. See how many people I can piss off in this talk. So you have a look and you find that you try to guess whether it's leftward or rightward. And if you get it right, then that shows that this brain area has information about whether the stimulus is going left or right. And if you're Frank Tong, you can do other really clever things, like you can actually say, okay, let's have no net direction. Let's have 4 cars going one way and 4 cars going the other way, and see if you can mind read your blind people and see whether they thought it was going to the left or the right. And we can do that too. And so what you find is that if you go to planum temporale, this auditory area, in sighted and late blind individuals, you can classify the direction of auditory motion from this planum temporale region, right? Which makes sense. I told you it was an auditory motion area, so I'm just living up to what I promised. But what's really interesting is that Mike May, the sight recovery subject, and in early blind individuals, you can't. Now that's weird, right? Think about that. Hang on. Blind people are better at auditory motion processing. This is the auditory motion area. What's going on here? Why are they worse? My postdoc was like, this makes no sense. I've tried everything. But when you look at, so now we'll look at MT. So this is this visual motion area. We're classifying the direction of auditory motion. So you can't do it in sighted individuals. You can't do it in late blind individuals. That makes sense. But if you look at MM in early blind, you can do it in this motion area. So it looks like what's happened is that this processing of auditory motion has moved from the planum temporale, which is this pretty small, poxy little area, to MT, which is a monster of an area. And that might be what's making these people better at this task. And it seems to be something that requires loss of vision early in life, not in your first year. Mike was blind at 3, but something kind of teenage. You can't lose, this doesn't happen in someone who loses their vision in their 50s. So let's go beyond the left, right. Let's get a little bit more sophisticated and let's really think about motion. So motion is spatial change over time, but there are 2 ways that kind of you can have sort of a motion stimulus. One is spatial changes over time that look like that. And for those of you who are blind, what I'm showing is a dot. And the dot is basically just kind of hopping from one place to another. So it doesn't have an impression of smooth motion. It's just kind of like it appears in one spot, that it moves over, a few inches, and then it reappears, and then it moves again. So that's the first one. And the second one is just a kind of continuous motion where this dot is just kind of rolling across the screen beautifully. What we do know is that in typically sighted individuals in this area MT, we are exquisitely tuned to that smooth continuous motion. We can tell smooth continuous motion from that static change with incredible sensitivity. And the neurons that we have in that area are really tuned for that kind of smooth continuous motion. And one way to describe that is what's called the space-time diagram. So here what I have is the x-axis is space, and the y-axis is time. And the tuning here on the top is a kind of oval going from top right to bottom left that's kind of just sort of continuous. So it's sort of tracking this idea of something moving continuous in space and time. And on the bottom, I have like a series of circular dots, okay? And there's all sorts of math about why these things are kind of considered different, and I'm going to ignore all that in the interest of time. So what Munju basically has decided is, okay, well, let's see how sensitive, and one thing we do know is that it's not at all clear whether sighted individuals really do have continuous motion perception for audition. We know you have it for vision, but it's not at all clear that you have it for audition. It's kind of the jury's out. So what she has is this beautiful task. One is just a series of sequence of sounds that kind of continuously move from left to right. The second one, what you can see is the first two are in sequence. Then the sounds are going randomly over space. And then the last two are in sequence. And the last one, they're all random. And the reason we had those first two and the last two stuck in what we call the onset-off condition is we know that people are much more sensitive to the onset and the offset of sounds. They're kind of sound physics reasons for that I'm not going to go into. So what we wanted to do is sort of say, okay, we know that you're really sensitive to where the onset is and where the offset is. So we're going to fix those across the conditions and see what happens in the middle. Okay. And so the idea is that are you going to be sensitive? How are you going to, what are the never mind, I'll explain later. whatever, I'm not going to tell you why I'm doing it. I'm just telling you it's going to be cool. So we're going to play the same game again. We're going to take these regions of interest, HMT, planum. I'm trying to be entertaining because I know it's the end of the day. And like everyone's going to fall asleep if I don't. So if this region HMT plus, which again is the visual motion area, we've got this region planum temporale, we've got these three stimulus. One is this nice smooth motion. One is this onset off condition. The other is random. We get our training set for the data for these brain regions. And now we're trying to guess what kind of stimulus it was. Okay, so what we find is in the planum temporale in the sighted individuals, we can tell. Oh, this is their performance. So they can tell the difference between these stimuli, but they actually find it really surprisingly difficult. But what's really interesting is here's the planum temporale. What you can see is they can tell the sequential. So this is an example where it's a 3x3 grid. This is gonna be hard to explain, but I'm gonna do my best. It's a 3x3 grid. And basically the stimulus was either sequential, on or offset or random. And then we're guessing from the responses in planum temporale whether the stimulus was sequential, onset, or offset, or random. So if we get it right, the square is white. And if we were at chance, then this whole thing would just be evenly gray. And so what you can see is that we can tell when the stimulus is random, we often say the brain often thinks it's random. The brain often has responses consistent with being random. Same thing for sequential. And then the onset and offset condition seems like it's intermediate between those two other conditions. It's right. You can tell the random from the onset. You can tell the random from the sequential. So you can tell sounds that go from. I'm using frequency here as a proxy for space. But onset and offset just sounds intermediate between the two. It doesn't sound like a distinct thing. Okay. And the reason I've got two graphs there is that we've run this experiment twice and we get the same result both times. In fact, that looks identical, which is a little worrying. Okay, if we look at HMT in these same sighted individuals, you can see that, again, we've run the experiment twice. And basically that kind of look is all just kind of gray. You can't tell these stimuli apart in MT, which fits with what I told you earlier, that in sighted individuals, MT doesn't really have any selectivity for auditory motion. Now we're going to go back to the blind individuals and we're going to play a trick. What we're going to do is we're going to actually try to define MT really accurately in these blind individuals, which is something I've been wanting to do for 15 years. So this is really exciting for me. So what we're going to do is something called quantitative MRI imaging, which is what you should be doing on your CVI kids. Though you will have to keep them still for 40 minutes. I'm sure. Okay. Super glue them to the table. It will be fine. They'll love it. Anyway, so what we do is it's basically a very good measure of the underlying neuroanatomy of brains and includes a really good measure of myelination. Now, what we know about brains is that primary sensory areas like V1 or somatosensory or auditory cortex are really heavily myelinated. They have this layer of myelin in the anatomy, which is due to the inputs from the LGN and the superior cortex, these kind of myelinated inputs that are coming up from the subcortical areas. It turns out that MT is also very heavily myelinated. So this is an example of a myelination diagram in the sighted controls, and you can see somatosensory cortex there has this beautiful myelination. You can see auditory cortex in the middle there has beautiful myelination. You see V1, it's really pretty, these maps. And what we have here in that blue line is our functionally defined MT. So this is the region that responds to motion versus stationary stimuli, is that kind of blue line you see there. You can see it's a bit bigger because remember I said HMT plus includes MT, MST, and some additional areas. So the myelin bit is probably the MT and MST. How many more? I got Okay. Now cytochromals. What's going on? What? Okay. I'm going to skip that. Now we're going to look at it in blind individuals, and what you can see is it looks a little different. In this case, the myelin is not overlapping and extending beyond. It's actually kind of like there's two areas here. So now what we have really, you can think about it as there being kind of two MTs that we can define in these blind individuals. One is the region that's responding to auditory motion, and the other one that's overlapping but is not exactly the same as this myelinated region of MT. Okay. So let's look at the anatomy. Let's look at what happens to this sequential versus random motion in these two areas. The functional localizer was a completely different scan. And so if we look at the functional localizer, we see responses that look very much like the ones we saw for sighted individuals. You can tell sequential from random, and the onset offset looks kind of intermediate between the two, like you just can't tell what they are. But when we look at the area that's the myelinated defined MT, some of which actually didn't show that strong response to the visual myelinated MT, we see a really different pattern of results. Now, this thing can tell the difference. It can tell the difference between onset, offset, sequential, and random. It hears them as three different stimuli. So it isn't simply like, okay, I can generally tell if it's going this way or that way, but I don't really have much sense of what's going on in the middle. Now we're actually starting to see something that looks much more like what we would expect from something with genuine spatiotemporal selectivity, i.e. tuning for continuous motion. And what's really cool about it is we're finding this in an area that is kind of innately set up to have this kind of tuning. I must be out of time now, right? Yeah, okay, then I'm going to skip all that. I'm going to skip all of that. I'm going to give us time for questions or go home early and have a drink, whatever you choose. I don't, no pressure. So what I've told is a sort of fairly simple story that sweeps a ton under the rug, but probably not as much as lofty with the CVI kids. So HMT, sorry. HMT plus is recruited for auditory motion in early blinded. But at least we confess, dude. You and me, we confess. HMT plus is recruited for auditory motion in early blinded individuals. This plasticity is developmental. It happens in early childhood and reduces planum temporale selectivity for motion. I think this is the most interesting result I've had in years, and I still don't know how to study it because what it implies, and actually I really want to talk to Magranka about that, because what it implies is that cortical areas are somehow competing with each other for role. And so I've been actually reading Magranka's stuff, trying to work out how that could be done through synaptic scaling, even though these are kind of cross-modal kind of areas that sort of have nothing to do with each other. They're miles away on cortex, well, several centimeters. And so there's this, that should not be computation, that should be competition between areas for cortical roles. But we know that this developmental plasticity has a functional impact. Blind people are better at auditory motion processing. And the slides I flipped through was another kind of really beautiful example of blind people being awesome at auditory motion processing. And finally, what Wenju has shown is that core or anatomical MT has different properties than cross-modal MT. And that is something we had not seen previously because we'd only ever used a functional definition of MT. We had never kind of linked it to the underlying anatomy in a careful way. And then the bit I missed is, although early blind individuals are better at auditory motion computations than sighted individuals, interestingly enough, that spatial temporal tuning response we see in MT doesn't seem to be driving their auditory motion computations behaviorally, at least in the task we've been using to assess it. And with that, I will say thank you.
So the common side questions? What, sorry? What do you want? Okay, do you want one brief question or
Yep.
switch to the?
I don't care.
Okay, we'll have one dedicated brief question to Ione before we start the general discussion.
Hi, Ione. I'm intrigued your results with subject MM. I certainly don't know him as well as you do, but I know that he's an individual he's an athlete. He has incredible navigation skills and independence. So I'm just wondering how generalizable you think the effect that you saw with him would say, for example, if you had a chance to work with sight recovery and cataract patients, for example.
So our original finding that you get this overlap between MT and functional and visual functional MT and auditory functional MT. We did that in 2 patients, and that's all we've ever done. And it was much weaker in the other patient. But it was consistent. We also see these functional responses in MT in blind individuals. Everybody sees them. They're very well established. And that's, but well, the question has always been, you know, how well are those overlapping with real MT? And we've just never had a way to solve this till then. So I think I am pretty sure I've done a pretty careful analysis of where you see these functional responses in blind people compared to where you'd expect to see MT. And MT does vary in location, but if you use surface-based alignment, you can get pretty close. And there isn't a fundamental shift in blind individuals. So I think we are going to find an overlap with these myelin maps. What I think is really interesting is that what we've been thinking of as one area, I think now maybe 2. One is true MT, and the other might be auditory motion area that is quite close to MT that Olivia Collignon calls AMT.
Okay,
my
thank you
question.
so much. Great talk.